So Jordan talked about bringing to a community a history they were unaware of. There is a community aspect to what we're doing in this exhibit about orcas, which will be opening in May 2020. There are academic links. Jason Colby at the University of Victoria has a recent book on orcas. We're drawing on that and many other people for this project. This will be the first time the world has seen an exhibit on orcas, and only orcas, not a whales exhibit, an exhibit just on orcas. And a number of people are involved in that, and my role as a social historian with an early background teaching world environmental history at U of Vic before I came to the museum is to talk about the contemporary ways in which people's views of nature have changed. And that's very appropriate to orcas. It's a contemporary story. And in this community, probably in this room, there are many people who have personal encounters and experiences with orcas, whether it was from a boat in the Gulf Islands, or it was in marine land or an aquarium, or watching the film Free Willy as a child or something. People have these personal, very deep emotional experiences, but they haven't really thought that they might have a history, that they might reflect social change. And so those are the kinds of themes I'm looking at, and I'm using objects to talk about those shifting views and things like commodification and so forth. So we also want this story to be involved in a weaving of a diversity of voices. But to break down the workload in the exhibit, my colleague Martha Black is working with various indigenous communities and elders. Gavin Henke is working with his network of marine biologists and scientists. And I'm working with social debates, but I'm also in contact with a number of members of community scientists and environmental activists. So the idea is to break the workload down and then bring it together and then weave it together. And with a designer from Spain whose first language is not English for sure. But actually it's going quite well, I think. So what you have here is a 45 that was sold in Oak Bay at the Oak Bay Marina. The very famous in the 1950s and 60s jazz flautist Paul Horn. But I playing flute to an orca called Haida in captivity at Sealand of the Pacific, the early aquarium in Oak Bay at the marina. What I find interesting is top billing is given to the orca. The human comes second. I also have found out that orcas had a hit record. Namu had a hit record and his own dance, which is sort of a Hully-Gully fringe bikini kind of dance. We have footage in Seattle. And so it's very interesting to start playing with this idea of orca as other, orca in which we layer human names and meanings and give certain human characteristics to, but is actually a different form of life from the other two-thirds of our planet, the water. And as we've worked on this project over the last year, we've come to, I've certainly come to the conclusions that this is a place of origins in world history, oddly enough. This has one of the longest relationships of indigenous people, not the longest. The Ainu have, in northern Japan, have a relationship with orcas. But we have a long established relationship here with indigenous peoples. This is where the world's first live capture of orcas happened. Most of the orcas in aquariums around the world up till 1975 were taken here in the Pacific Northwest. And in fact, Gavin was suddenly shocked to realize the orca he saw as a child at Niagara Falls was taken from an incident at Penn Cove, which is a very terrible and tragic event. This is where the first aquariums began publicly displaying orcas and started working out the logistics of training them to perform. This is the place where all marine science on orcas began. Yeah, Gavin will talk about science, but I'm interested in the culture of science. And it's a culture of personalities, people with names like Michael Biggs, John Ford, Kenneth Balcom, people like that. And in fact, UBC has been turning out the highest density of Masters of Science and doctorates on orcas. So this is where science comes from, and that science is being copied, and observation systems are being applied off Chile, South Africa, Norway, Iceland, all around the world. This is also the place portrayed in Hollywood perceptions of orcas, and Hollywood discovered orcas here. The first film, Namu, is set in the Pacific Northwest, and Free Willy is set in Seattle and Tacoma and involves the Haida. And the sequels are set between the northern tip of Vancouver Island and Haida Gwaii. This is where Greenpeace discovered Save the Whales, in a marina at an aquarium with Paul Spong and an orca, and shifted them from the anti-nuclear testing campaigns to Save the Whales, which affected other species around the world. This is also possibly the oldest site for commercial orca whale watching. It's not necessarily the oldest place for whale watching, and it's also the first place that wrestled with the idea of regulating whale watching and orca, or what to do about orcas, creating a marine park specifically for orcas. So what happened here has had a global impact, and that is the story we hope that this exhibit will have when it is taken to Europe, to places like Iceland and Norway, where debates about orcas, Germany, France, Spain, and other places. This museum was involved with orcas, starting with the stranding of a pod, possibly from naval bombing in 1946 at Estevan Point. 40 orcas were driven into the shallows and died, and Clifford Carl went up and published a science article on that from this museum. And it was not far from here that the subject of Moby doll in Jason's book was an orca mortally wounded by a harpoon. They were intending to kill it for a skeleton for the Vancouver Aquarium, and instead they took it to a dock in Vancouver where after 30 days, despite heroic efforts by vets dealing with this creature for the first time in veterinary history, tried to save it, but it died. And that's the moment in which what was seen up to this point as a killer whale, a ferocious, dangerous marine creature, became, through Moby doll, something else, an intelligent creature with a language, biology, and people began to look closely at it. Live capture continued with Namu from Namu, BC, which was sold to Tacoma. And it was Scanna, an orca in the Vancouver Aquarium, who convinced Paul Spong, who had a PhD, that orcas were intelligent, because he turned a science test on its head and gave 42 wrong answers in a row, which was statistically impossible the way the test was constructed, and convinced Paul that he was dealing with something that was as smart as him because it understood his test and flipped it. And it's Paul who brought Greenpeace to see this way. Orcas on land become commodities. The whale Shamu, supposed to have originally been a mate for Namu, who died, that show at Sealand was so successful in California that Shamu became a brand. And other orcas were labeled Shamu and put on Shamu shows in Japan, Germany, Britain, Spain, and so forth. So you have commodification. I looked for large, tacky, odd objects I could acquire. And you also have artists painting, but you also have writers. And it struck me that writers writing for children about orcas, or children being experienced to orcas in aquariums, is somewhat like the Charlotte Webb linkage to vegetarianism. They grow up to really care about orcas. They love orcas. But there comes a point as teenagers and young adults where that transforms into a question about what is ethical, what is right for. So that process has been happening. Hollywood wasn't sure. The earliest film about Namus, sparked by the events in the Pacific Northwest, was followed by a post-Jaws period where these sorts of films were made. Jaws of Death was made at Alert Bay, up to Free Willy, which is a CGI and mechanical whale. But there was a real whale involved in that film, and there's a whole story about the movement, a global movement of children to free that whale, which did take place. But it involved air transportation to Iceland, a crashed airplane, an orca extracted from an aviation crash, and 47 failed attempts, the first in science, to release an orca into the wild. So there's some really dramatic told in here. It's about social debate. The Free Morgan is a debate in Europe on whether or not orcas have, what are the rights before the court of orcas? Who owns what's wild? Who owns what's in the womb of something wild that's taken? Is it a corporate commodity or not? Who has jurisdiction on things that live in open ocean? We have established marine parks here in BC. We're talking about noise levels, plastics, marine shipping, and we're starting to think very deeply, and this photo was taken here in Victoria, about what does this mean? And orcas become a bit of a symbol to get us discussing as planetary citizens, what is it that we want for the future in our oceans, not just for orcas. The outputs of this, we hope, will be a successful international exhibit. We're working on an anthology of voices, and I've been contacting people whose lives were changed by orcas. They became activists and have been for a good 25 years out here, and they're contributing essays on their personal experiences with orcas. And we hope the book also will be a blending of voices from children and young Indigenous poets and writers to elders in the environmental activist community. So what we really want is to engage the community in a social discussion using an exhibit, using our learning programs, using our publications. Thank you.